Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, and for the next half hour, I'm going to be going on about things that I think you should know about. If you have any reactions to the show, email me directly. Whoviating, WHOVIATING, is at AO.com, that is. That's my personal email. Or you can go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. You can leave a comment there, or you can get the email address from there if you'd like. If you do send me email, please be sure to include something in the subject line that makes it clear it's not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer because I'm kind of slow about email. All right, let's get on with it. I usually like to start with some good news, but this week we're going to start with some not good news. You've no doubt heard that on March 26th, Indiana Governor Mike Pence signed the so-called Religious Freedom Restoration Act for the state of Indiana. The problems with this piece of trash start with the name, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, as if religious freedom had been stripped away from residents of Indiana and now had to be restored. Well, if you ask what kind of freedoms had been lost and what examples were there of people prevented from practicing their religion, you didn't get any, except if you want to include, for example, one state legislator referred to a case in another state where a florist had been sued because they refused to provide flowers for a same-sex wedding. Which actually shows, that example actually, and the fact that it was cited, shows what this bill is really about and what freedom is being restored. The freedom to be a bigot and to ignore anti-discrimination laws. Because that's what the bill does. That's what this bill does. The most controversial part of it is found in Section 9, and I'm going to quote this whole paragraph just to make sure. Okay, a person whose exercise of religion has been substantially burdened, or is likely to be substantially burdened, by a violation of this chapter, may assert the violation or impending violation as a claim or defense in a judicial or administrative proceeding, regardless of whether or not the state or any other governmental agency is a party to the proceeding. Now, that last part is the big one, the important one, because defenders of this law like to point to the fact that the federal government and 19 other states have these similar, restoration of religious freedom acts, but every one of those laws involves the government supposedly burdening the free exercise of religion. Not one of those offers protection for-profit businesses that this one does, or that it includes disputes between private parties that don't involve the government at all. Nor do those other laws specifically identify and define a person as a corporation, which this one does in Section 5. So when defenders of the bill tells you it's just the same as all the other ones, so what's the problem? They either don't know what they're talking about or they are lying through their teeth. There is no other option. Now, one of the chief liars here is Governor One Cent, who, when he was asked directly if this bill would allow for discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, LGBT people, his response was to talk in bumper stickers about how Hoosiers don't like discrimination, but he ran away, multiple times in fact, ran away from actually answering the direct question. Indeed, when he signed the bill in a private ceremony from which all media were barred, 3 of the people present were lobbyists for groups that want to limit LGBT rights. One of those lobbyists, Eric Miller, of a group called Advance America, praised this new law as doing exactly what Governor Not Worth a Farthing did his best to avoid admitting. This bill would, Miller said, protect Christian bakers, florists, and photographers from penalty, quote, for refusing to participate in a homosexual marriage, among other examples, unquote. Fact is, this bill should not be called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It should be called the God Gave Me the Right to Be a Bigot Act. Several sources have claimed that the actual impact of such a bill would be small because these claims, by and large, have been rejected by the courts. I don't know if that's true or not, and frankly, I don't care. Because the right wing sees this bill, sees these sorts of bills as a means to oppose same-sex marriage, as to oppose the rights of LGBT people. That's what these bills are about. That is what they are for, and that is why they must be opposed. Which makes the reaction to the passage of the God gave me the right to be a bigot law, makes that reaction such good news. Governor Not Worth a Farthing was, in the words of the Indianapolis Star, the state's largest paper, quote, scorched by a fast-spreading political firestorm. Firestorm intense enough that he almost immediately started promising unspecified clarifications. Just some examples of the pushback. For one, thousands of people rallied at the Capitol Mall against the bill. Greg Ballard, who is the mayor of Indianapolis, which is, you probably know is the capital of Indiana, he called on the state to add sexual orientation to its civil rights laws and said he was going to issue an executive order requiring all local businesses, all Indianapolis businesses, to follow the city's human rights ordinance, which does include some protections for LGBT people. The Indianapolis Star published a blistering front-page editorial demanding the law be changed to make it clear it does not allow for discrimination against, again, LGBT people. 9 CEOs of some of Indiana's largest employers, including Eli Lilly, Anthem, and Indiana University, signed a letter to Governor Not Worth a Farthing and other legislative leaders telling them to reform the act so that it cannot be used to, quote, justify discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The CEO of Angie's List, his name is Bill Osterly, canceled his company's proposed multi-million-dollar expansion of its Indianapolis headquarters. The CEO of San Francisco-based Salesforce.com declared it's going to stop having meetings in Indiana. AFSCME, this is the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, it's a union representing public employees, said it's moving an October conference out of Indiana because of this. Former NBA star Charles Barkley and sports commentator Keith Olbermann have called on the NCAA to pull the Final Four out of Indianapolis. And the NCAA itself said it is surprised and disappointed by the law and said, depending upon what this clarification proves to be, it will have to, quote, make judgments about whether or not it, that is the law, changes the environment for us doing our work and us holding events. The governors of 3 states, Connecticut, Washington, and New York, and the mayors of at least 4 cities, Portland, Oregon, San Diego, San Francisco, and Seattle, have announced that they are banning taxpayer-funded travel to Indiana. And what likely is a result of the fallout about this law, the Montana State Legislature rejected a proposed referendum that, if passed by voters, would have given people grounds to disobey any state law that they thought violated their religion. In Montana now, at least they didn't pretend that this had nothing to do with LGBT rights, because in fact supporters used examples of county clerks being able to refuse to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, and pharmacists being allowed to refuse to fill birth control prescriptions as examples of what the law would accomplish. The important thing here is that in Montana they failed. The vote was close. It was, in fact, it was as close as it could possibly be, but they failed. And that, too, is good news. Which unhappily segues us back into not good news. The Arkansas legislature has passed a bill essentially identical to Indiana's, and the bill sponsors there say there will be no clarifications. Doug McMillan, who is the CEO of Walmart, which is headquartered in Arkansas, has called on the governor to veto the bill. But the governor, his name is Asa Hutchinson, has previously indicated that he's going to sign it. Meanwhile, North Carolina is considering a bill that's even worse than these. Now, other laws, for example, say that the issue arises in the case of a substantial burden on the supposed free exercise of religion. This one only requires a burden. And where others say that those claims can be overridden by a compelling state interest, this one says that that interest must be of the highest magnitude. What it would do simply is to make a claim by any passing bigot, whether individual or corporate, to make a claim for a special exemption from civil rights laws. It would make that claim easier to make and harder to challenge. Now, a number of people have actually noticed, in regard to the response to the Indiana law, they've noted a difference between the God gave me the right to be a bigot laws and the others, most of which were passed years ago, and the point of the difference being the political and social environment in which they were enacted and this was enacted, which is absolutely true. There has been real progress on this. The reaction to the Indiana law proves it. But that very fact means the reactionaries will fight even harder, look for every trick they can find to stop, halt, and roll back those gains. This is not over. All right, we're going to move on to one of our regular weekly features. It's the Clown Award, given as always for meritorious stupidity. Now, I'd actually retired 2 people from the Clown Awards because they were just too easy as targets, and so it wasn't fair to the other aspirants. One of them is Supreme Court Justice Antonin Skeletor, but occasionally I would bring one of these guys out of retirement just to show the old folks still got it. So today, this week, the winner of the Big Red Nose is the man with the world's most perfect initials, Fox News host Bill O'Reilly. You see, he wrote this book called Killing Jesus. It was a bestseller due to the need, the compulsive need of his audience, whose average age, no lie, is 72. Their compulsive need to lap up everything he spills. His book was also bad enough and historically wrong enough that a biblical scholar whose political complaint about Bill O'Reilly is that he's not conservative enough wrote his own book, ripping it apart. Well, Killing Jesus, the book, has been made into Killing Jesus, the cable TV movie. And based on the reviews, a bad movie. For example, the New York Daily News considered it so-so, but also said that, quoting, many of the characters feel as if they could have stepped out of a modern-day action-adventure drama. More harshly, The Guardian called it a Tea Party version of The Son of God, and the Boston Globe called it shallow, distended, and overbaked. But Bill O'Reilly, B.O., knows the real truth behind these judgments. So on his show on March 30th, he dismissed all of the criticism of the film. The negative reviews, he declared with all the authority of the Sermon on the Mount, were just part of the ongoing assault on Judeo-Christian tradition by the secular progressive left, who wrote the bad reviews of his noble endeavor because it had a religious agenda which they absolutely cannot tolerate. Because, as we all know, people like Martin Luther King, the Berrigans, Dorothy Day, Cesar Chavez, the list goes on and on and on, none of them were Christians. And you know, that must be true, of course, because, quoting B.O., any embrace of Christian tradition is a danger to the agenda of the left. It was easy to see that, he said, in the reviews. I mean, after all, the movie must be good because the book it was based on was inspired by the Holy Spirit, or as we used to call it when I was a kid, the Holy Ghost. B.O. told 60 Minutes that the Holy Spirit came to him in the middle of the night and directed him to write this book. So he did. And Killing Jesus followed his earlier books, Killing Lincoln and Killing Kennedy, which raises the question of if he was channeling the Holy Spirit or if he was channeling the spirit of the late Jim Bishop, whose books included The Day Christ Died, The Day Lincoln Was Shot, and The Day Kennedy Was Shot. Well, no matter. What's important is that Bill O'Reilly knows the truth, and the truth is it's open season on Christians in the United States, Christians who are horribly oppressed because, and you got to know it's true because it's like every other day we hear about some poor oppressed Christian who was fired from their job because their boss found out they went to Mass last Sunday. And that's the real reason, he says, that's the only reason, he says, his his noble endeavor got bad reviews. They say the Lord works in mysterious ways, and B.O. is certainly one of the more mysterious of them. Bill O'Reilly, clown. We're taking a break. And we're back. Now, something I haven't talked about in a while, but is really, really important and is actually back in the news, is voter suppression. The active attempts by the right wing to keep people from voting, or more exactly, to keep the wrong sorts of people from voting, the wrong sorts being those that the right wing figures cannot be relied on to reliably vote right wing. That is, the right wing is trying to game the system so that ultimately only reliable right-wing voters get to vote. This is, to be blunt, a deliberate and conscious plan, born of a deliberate and conscious intent to do away with anything that could be called a real democracy. And that is not an overstatement. Back in 1980, Paul Weyrich, co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, founder of the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, and the so-called father of the modern right wing, said, and I'm quoting him, "I don't want everybody to vote. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting population goes down." In 2008, the Supreme Court upheld an Indiana voter ID law requiring people to present a photo ID at the voting booth, at the voting place, in order to be allowed to vote. When that happened, Weyrich's dreams of voter suppression really began to soar. Since then, multiple states have tried, and some have succeeded in imposing voter ID laws based on the claim that these laws prevent the rampant voter fraud that exists. Now, in getting support for these laws as being constitutional, they have largely succeeded in the courts despite overwhelming evidence on 2 points. One is that voter fraud of any sort in the U.S. is extremely rare, and the only type of fraud that these voter ID laws could address, which is so-called in-person voter fraud, where somebody goes to the polls and tries to pretend they're somebody else in order to vote, that kind of fraud is essentially non-existent. For several years, Justin Levitt, a professor at the Loyola University Law School, he's been studying and tracking cases of in-person voter fraud. Now, not prosecutions of cases, not just prosecutions, but in his words, any specific credible allegation that someone may have pretended to be someone else at the polls in any way that an ID law could fix. Well, last fall, he wrote that he had found about 31 different incidents since 2000 anywhere in the country. To put this in perspective, I'm quoting Professor Levitt now. To put this in perspective, the 31 incidents come in the context of general, primary, special, and municipal elections from 2000 through 2014. In general and primary elections alone, more than 1 billion ballots were cast in that period. So even if all 31 of these cases actually were real in-person voter fraud, and all of them took place in general and primary elections rather than special or municipal elections, that would still give a fraud rate of 0.000003%. Meanwhile, Professor Levitt also found that in just 4 states that have used these voter ID laws in just 4 elections, more than 3,000 votes in general elections alone have been affirmatively rejected for lack of ID. That is, these are people who actually showed up at the polls and were told you can't vote because you don't have this ID. Which in turn raises the second point here, which is that not only is in-person voter fraud vanishingly rare, thousands upon thousands of people are being denied the right to vote because of these laws. The Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law, which studies voting issues, reports that as many as 11% of otherwise eligible voters in the U.S. do not have photo IDs. More significantly, and more to the point of the right wing's real intentions, the center reports that the percentage of people lacking these IDs, quoting, is even higher for seniors, people of color, people with disabilities, low-income voters, and students. That is higher among basically the groups that the right wing wants to keep from voting. Voter photo ID laws are nothing but a right-wing scam to hinder and, where possible, block the votes of anyone they think is more likely to vote in a more liberal direction rather than a reactionary one. All right, so why do I return to this now? Because they've just notched another victory in their drive to turn voting into a sport for the elite. On March 23rd, the Supreme Court turned away a challenge to Wisconsin's voter photo ID law. Now, passed in 2011, the law had been under challenge ever since. In fact, federal district judge Lynn Edelman had struck down the law as unconstitutional, finding that, quoting the judge, virtually no voter impersonation occurs in Wisconsin and is it exceedingly unlikely that voter impersonation will become a problem in Wisconsin in the foreseeable future because, he said, it would be crazy to do it when you weigh the penalties, which is a felony conviction, against the possible gain, which is that you might change one vote. Edelman also noted that in defending the law, the state of Wisconsin could not point to a single instance of known voter impersonation in Wisconsin any time in the recent past. Unfortunately, a panel of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals overturned that decision in a ruling handed down literally just hours after hearing oral arguments and without citing a single basis for the decision or addressing a single finding Judge Edelman made. It was the appeal of that decision that the Supreme Court refused to hear, again, without explanation. Which means that neither the appeals court nor the Supreme Court actually addressed any of the findings that Judge Edelman made or any of the arguments that were raised. They just shrugged them off and said, in effect, so why do people are being prevented from voting to solve a problem that doesn't exist? Who cares? In fact, that is what Governor Scott Walk-all-over-you of Wisconsin called great news for Wisconsin voters. What's the effect of this great news? As many as 300,000 registered voters in Wisconsin could be disenfranchised, could be prevented from voting because they don't have a form of ID required under the law, a number disproportionately composed of African Americans and Hispanic voters. To give you an idea of the size, that 300,000, that's equivalent to 12.5% of the entire voter turnout in the 2014 elections in Wisconsin. And obtaining the required ID is no easy task. Supposedly, the state provides free IDs at state Department of Motor Vehicles offices, but only 1/3 of those are even open full-time. There's only one of them in the entire state of Wisconsin that's open on a Saturday. And don't forget, the people who need these free IDs, they don't drive, or they'd have a photo ID. They don't drive, so they have to rely on public transportation to get to these offices during their limited hours. But the right-wingers don't care. Well, and actually, that's not right. I have to correct myself. They do care. This is exactly what they wanted. They do care. And all this is happening even as Richard Posner, he's a conservative judge who, as a member of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, wrote the decision supporting the Indiana's voter ID law, saying it was constitutional, the decision that was then upheld by the Supreme Court that opened these floodgates. Richard Posner now says he, quote, absolutely, unquote, got that case wrong, and that these sorts of voter ID laws do, in fact, disenfranchise people entitled to vote. So why aren't people more disturbed about this? Why aren't they more upset about the rights being stripped away in service of an economic and social elite? Well, maybe because, in fact, certainly in part because of the utter failure of our so-called media to simply tell the truth. And reporting on the Supreme Court's refusal to take up the challenge of the Wisconsin law, this is how the Washington Post described the issue. It referred to, quoting, measures that Republicans say combat fraud and Democrats say discourage voting among minorities, the elderly, and the poor. Earlier in March, this is how our paper of record, the New York Times, put the issue, quoting, Republicans have passed new laws requiring voters to show identification cards and restricting early voting hours, arguing these methods would help prevent voter fraud. Democrats say such fraud is nearly non-existent and charge that the laws are a new push to disenfranchise minority voters and the poor. In other words, it's presented as just as another case of A said this and B said that. Just another bit of political back and forth, just more blah, blah, just more partisan blather, who knows who's right, and yada, yada, yada. But there's an objective reality here. An objective reality testified to by multiple studies from multiple sources. An objective reality that says that one side in this argument is telling the truth and one side is lying. But our national media, unfortunately, most of us still depend on the national media for our information. Our national media has long since supplanted journalism with official stenography, is satisfied to just say A says this and B says that, leaving us uninformed, malinformed, and misinformed. As our right to vote is slowly and increasingly circumscribed in service to a long-range plan of subverting democracy in pursuit of enshrining a permanent, unchallengeable elite that a lord of the manor in a medieval estate would be jealous of. We're often told by the Tea Party minions of the right that our democracy is in danger. Well, they are right, just not for any of the reasons they imagine. All right, after that, I need to lighten things up a little bit. So we've got a case here of unintentional humor, where something not supposed to be funny just is. On March 23rd, the Wall Street Journal reported that based on information from President and former officials of the Obama administration, Israel had been spying on the U.S.-led negotiations with Iran and then leaking cherry-picked details of that to the press in order to undermine the talks. Israeli officials vociferously denied spying on the U.S., saying that they don't do that, and in fact, they hadn't done that since their spy Robert Pollard got caught doing it in the 1980s. Besides, they said, there are lots of other people who could be spying on to get this information. But here's the good part. U.S. officials said they learned Israel was spying on the talks when U.S. intelligence agencies intercepted communications in which Israeli officials referred to information which the U.S. believes could only have come from one of the participants. Which means that the U.S. learned the offensive fact that Israel was spying on the talks because the U.S. was spying on Israel. So it goes. All right. I'm going to leave aside the outrage of the week for this week. I don't have time for it, but instead I'm going to do this. We have an episode of And Another Thing, our occasional foray into cool science stuff. And here's one of the most common misconceptions about evolution is found in the charge. It's supposed to be a withering attack. Charge that it can't explain how life began. Well, that's true. It can't, because it doesn't try to. Evolution is about how life changes in interaction with environment over time. The question of how life began is an entirely different field of study called abiogenesis. Now, the problem for abiogenesis is that the origin of life on Earth looks like a string of conundrums. There has to be something like DNA or RNA to make proteins, but modern cells can't copy and make new DNA and RNA without those proteins. And none of these molecules can do their job without fatty lipids, which provide the membrane so that cells can keep the stuff inside the cell. But the protein-based enzymes encoded by the DNA and RNA are what make the fatty lipids. In other words, everything already had to have what it is responsible for creating in order to create it. It's the old chicken and egg question. Well, now a team of researchers at Cambridge University at the United Kingdom say that they may have found two simple compounds, hydrogen cyanide and hydrogen sulfide, plus some ultraviolet light, can actually initiate chemical reactions which can produce these biomolecules by a different means, which means that this may be a mean to break out of the chicken and egg trap. So the work was published in the peer-reviewed journal Nature Chemistry. This does not prove this is how life started, but it does provide at least a plausible mechanism by which it could have happened, a mechanism that is in line with our best knowledge about the early Earth, which personally I think is pretty doggone cool. That's it for this week. Have the best week you can. Peace.